It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, Conservative MP Laura Farris, the SNP's Alison Thewlis, academic and writer Dalia Gebrial and commentator Patrick O'Flynn. Today, inflation hits 9%.
I know the Chancellor is looking at what more can be done in areas like tax and energy.
It is clear that the actions taken to date by the government do not meet the scale of the challenge.
As the cost of living crisis intensifies, Boris Johnson will face Keir Starmer at PMQs. We'll bring you that live. Are we about to have a trade war with Europe?
A breach of an international treaty that is international law is a breach of international law. That is going to cause a lot more problems than it solves.
Should Scotland become independent, it should seek membership of NATO.
Nicolas Sturgeon wants to join a nuclear-armed alliance, but she wants these nuclear submarines out of Scotland. Let's start with the Royal Commonwealth tour of Canada with the Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall. I just want to show you this headline with some reaction to that tour in the Daily Telegraph. Prince Charles urged to speak to the Queen about deaths of Indigenous children at Canada schools. It is a three-day tour. We can see pictures here of the royal couple in Canada. They have been talking to community leaders and politicians, including the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, as Canada is addressing a national scandal which saw Indigenous children die in the school system. Ahead of the trip, there had been calls for the Queen to apologise over the issue. And that is my question to the panel to start the programme. Should the royal family apologise for the treatment of Indigenous people in Canada? Laura?
I don't think so, no. I mean, that's an issue of governance, not an issue which the head of state would have any role over at all. Right,
but these are wrongs committed during a colonial past or during the time of the Commonwealth. Do you think this is something that the royal family should take on? They're certainly being asked to.
Well, I think the question that you're asking is what the role of the royal family is in the Commonwealth today and whether these sort of trips signify an ongoing sense of sort of imperialism that should last into the 21st century or not. And I think that the role of the royal family in the Commonwealth is evolving. I think that was acknowledged by Prince William when he did his tour of the Caribbean, and he said, our role is to ask you how best we can serve the family of nations in the years to come. So, look, I don't think that the royal family have a role in apologising for this, but I do think there is a conversation that is happening that the royal family are a participant to about its future role in the Commonwealth.
Dalia, what's your view? Prince Charles has said on the tour, we must find new ways to come to terms with darker and more difficult aspects of the past. But is Laura right in terms of the role of the royal family on these sorts of tours?
Well, I think it's very bizarre for us to be sitting in a studio in London telling the descendants of people who were colonised how to respond to people who are representatives of the institutions that colonised them. I think what we are experiencing globally is an emergence from not an age of innocence, but an age of ignorance, where the role of colonialism in shaping the inequalities that we currently still live in, that has been systemically erased from public knowledge. And thanks to the interventions of the descendants of people who have been colonised, that age of ignorance is no longer tenable. And so I think it is absolutely a given that the royal family should apologise, but that is just the first symbolic step in a broader reckoning of how we can right the wrongs of the past.
Including reparations?
Absolutely.
Patrick?
Politically, socially and financially.
No, I don't think so at all. I agree largely with what Laura said. I also think it's the new gotcha for royal family members going on a tour in many countries. Let's think of something they have to apologise for, and I think that's pretty dismal future for Prince Charles as monarch, for instance, going around the world saying sorry for his own country. And I suspect, you know, everyone who's pushing this agenda actually doesn't want to have a monarchy anyway. And I suspect, I don't know if Dahlia is a Republican, but I don't think trying to appease such determined political opponents is going to do anything for the royal family anyway. Is that what it's going to become, a gotcha moment every time the royal family go on tour?
Absolutely not, because this is just one symbolic starting point in what is a much broader political and social and economic programme of righting those historical wrongs. The apology is just the start. And my concern, much more than the future of the royal family, is actually the future of the Indigenous people of Canada, whose health inequalities, economic inequalities, and the aftermath of the cultural genocide that they've experienced is still ongoing today. It's not a historical question, it is a question of the present day.
Is that the role for the royal family to undertake in the way that Dahlia has set out? Should they expect every time they do visit a country as part of a Commonwealth tour that there will be protests, that there will be ongoing questions about past wrongs done to Indigenous peoples across Commonwealth countries that they have to respond to?
I think it's something that the royal family have to acknowledge. Prince Charles has acknowledged that in what he said. And I think there's an obligation in the royal family. It's not that they go around the world and get a photograph and come back home. If they're going, they have an obligation now to meet with people, to meet with organisations, to meet with the descendants of those who have been the victims of colonialism. And if they're going to do that, then yes, an apology should come as a result. Otherwise, it's just tokenistic.
Laura?
I think it's quite a regressive argument. They're not the government. They're representatives as head of state, and they obviously have a royal role. I do think that there is a legitimate discussion to be had after the Queen has been on the throne for 70 years as to what the future of the royal family looks like. Every single country in the world has undergone seismic changes of culture and governance in the last 70 years. But as I say, I think the royal family are an active participant in that conversation. I think they're taking a lead. I think Prince William did that in the Caribbean. So I don't think that it's a sort of something that's being done to them. But I don't like those gotcha moments. I don't like that sense that I do think they should interact with groups, and I think that they do when they go on these trips. But I don't think that they should be made to sort of grovel and apologise for the past.
All right, let's talk about the cost of living and inflation because of those eye-watering figures and levels of inflation. It's hit a 40-year high. We can see the graph here. It's actually from 1989 rather than the full 40 years because that's when CPI was used, the Consumer Price Index. But it has hit 9% in the 12 months to April. Patrick, what's your reaction to the figure?
Well, it obviously puts Rishi Sunak and Andrew Bailey at the Bank of England under massive pressure, particularly Andrew Bailey, who seems to have kind of been undercooked in terms of what was going to happen and for how long. The Tories need to take a decision, you know, about what the big story is here. It needs to be, Rishi Sunak needs to get ahead of this for once. His recent financial statement was little bits and bobs of tinkering and overspun and didn't work. So I suspect he's in submarine mode at the moment. He's putting other ministers out and not being in public much himself. I suspect he's going to come back with a bit of a big bang. And I personally would like to see an uprating earlier of benefits and pensions, because I think if the Tories... I do see Boris Johnson having one nation credentials in many respects. I know a lot of people don't, but I think this is a bit of a litmus test of that. The poorest need some help pretty quick with cash.
Laura, your response to the 9% figure for inflation?
It's a shocking figure, but national economics are at the mercy of geopolitics, and I think it needs to be sort of reiterated that the war effort in Ukraine and the application of sanctions and everything that's resulted from that has had a significant effect on inflation, and it could go up. So I sort of partly agree with what Patrick said, but not entirely. I think that the Chancellor has made a very significant effort to target help towards the poorest households. I know that people are struggling. They write to me. I'm sure they do to Alison too. But there has been a change to, for example, a reduction to the universal credit taper. There's been a 6.6% increase to the national living wage. There have been adjustments to national insurance contributions. I'm aware that the counter-argument is that they're not enough. People are working jobs.
It's the scale.
Exactly. I think that the Treasury is absolutely thinking. I don't think this is the end of the story. And just to give you one illustration of that, I've got a meeting with the Chancellor an hour after this show ends to talk about childcare and how that affects families and household budgets. And that is not the first conversation. It's going to be about the third or fourth I've had with him on that issue, with other MPs too. So the sense of there being an active dialogue on some of the highest costs that households face is something that I'm very aware of in the House.
Well, just before I come to Alison and Dahlia, let's have a look at some of the headlines which hint that Rishi Sunak is going to move on this. There have been suggestions, as you know, from the SNP more broadly, but certainly from Labour, about a windfall tax. Here in The Times, Sunak plans heating bill discounts and tax cuts. Warm home payouts, I should say, could quadruple to £600 before autumn budget giveaway. And we can show you this headline in The Telegraph. Ministers warm to energy windfall tax after polling finds it wildly popular with the public. Now, you will know, as you've heard it on this programme many times, Rishi Sunak has refused to rule it out. Boris Johnson too, which goes against the Tories' traditional stance that such tax rates deter investment. Is he going to move on it, do you think?
Well, look, I'm not in the Treasury, I'm just a backbench MP.
No, but just your gut feeling from everything you've heard and seen, and should he?
Well, I think that the tension that a windfall tax creates is at the same time the government is asking energy companies to look seriously at developing domestic energy supplies, particularly renewables, to meet the absolute imperative of climate change. They're also being asked to impose a tax on the business where they would normally be channeling some of that money into the things the government most wants it to do. So, look, that is the tension that exists. Should he? I think there is a strong argument for it, yes, Jo. Right, OK, sounds like you're moving towards it too. If he does, will you support it?
I would, and I think it has to be that broader-based windfall tax as well.
On oil and tax companies and on which others?
And some of these other big companies that have made huge profits during the course of the pandemic, the Amazons of this world, should be paying their fair share as well. But the Treasury also has had a significant windfall too, because if you think of the prices of everything that's gone up, they're getting much more money in tax revenues than they were expecting. That was true at the spring statement, and it's true now.
Right, and if it is just a windfall tax on oil and gas companies, will the SNP support it?
We will, yes.
You will?
We would like to see that extended. It makes sense to make that extended.
But just to get clearly from you, you would support that windfall tax, even if it's limited to oil and gas companies?
Yes, but because what we're seeing is not the issue around investment. Some of these big oil and gas companies, BP, are doing things like share buybacks, which is not money going into investment, that's money going into shareholders' pockets. That isn't fair at a time of crisis.
Dahlia, would that be enough?
It would be a start. I think that what we've just seen here is a classic economic myth that often gets peddled during these times of crisis. You know, can the British government control the price of oil? Of course not. Lots of different things go into that. But the government absolutely can decide what part of British society bears the brunt of that. And this government has made the active decision that it should be everyday people who bear the brunt of that, while pensioners are riding in buses in order to keep warm.
But you do accept that 80% of the rise in inflation has come from global external shocks, as Andrew Bailey was saying.
Oh, absolutely. But the actual experience of that inflation is down to the government. When you look in France, Spain and Italy, they are subsidising petrol. When you look at Spain, they are putting a cap on rent increases. While our pensioners are being left in the cold, literally, BP's profits have gone through the roof. The CEO of BP actually thanked the government for the lifting of energy caps because it turned BP into a cash machine, to use his words.
All right. Well, on that, Patrick, in terms of the conversation around how much intervention we can expect or should expect from the government in a time of crisis, should it be the same now as it was during COVID?
I don't think it can be quite that scale, but I think it needs to be more than we're seeing at the moment. And in terms of a windfall tax, as Laura was setting out, it's not great from a pure economic theory point of view. I think we need to get away from the idea that shareholders are a tiny rich elite. You know, a lot of pension funds prop up the living standards of millions of ordinary working people who've had occupational pensions. But I think pragmatic politics at the moment, those companies are making so much money that they'll whine about it and complain about it, but I suspect there will come a point where, as a one-year thing, a pragmatic Tory government will end up imposing some form of windfall tax.
You were nodding in agreement.
Well, I don't disagree with that analysis at all, but I think that is a very important point, the idea of sort of punishing these companies. I mean, a lot of ordinary people, ordinary pensioners who you were just talking about, have occupational pensions that are inherently tied up in oil and gas. You're also arguing for a pension cut, which I find extraordinary. And actually, the effect of the pension protection this Conservative government has had since it came in has had the biggest effect on driving down pensioner poverty in the last half a century.
Well, this is exactly why people's pensions shouldn't be in the hands of volatile shares. They should be state protected. It's state protected pensions.
You have a state pension, you have an occupational pension if you have a job.
The pension that you rely on when you are in your old age should be protected by the government. It should not be at the mercy
there is a state
of
pension,
unelected
but there's also
CEOs.
An occupational pension that probably everyone in this room who has a job
but
would have.
The point that is really important to make here is that, and you raised this of, framing the government helping everyday people in this crisis as state intervention. When Rishi Sunak lifts the energy cap so that oil and gas companies can have their profits protected in this energy crisis, that's a form of state intervention.
They didn't have profits the year before they made these record profits. But just to come back to your issue on the pensions, just explain to our viewers what you mean by state-protected pensions when there are. I mean, Laura is right to say there is a state pension, as people will know, and there are private occupational pensions. What are you saying, that all pensions should be state-protected?
The state pension should be enough for people to live on in their old age. The occupational pension can be a top-up for that, but the state pension, which is protected by the government, should be enough for people to live on. But this, as I said before, Rishi Sunak is intervening in the economy, but he's intervening on behalf of oil executives and not on behalf of everyday people.
The auto-enrolment policy that has required employers to provide a workplace pension to all employees, even from when they're very young, has been one of the biggest factors in driving down pensioner poverty, because it's the only way that people in the workplace have a way of investing a fixed proportion of their salary and seeing that grow over the decades. And it's absolutely changed the quality of life and the security that old people have.
So why are pensioners riding buses to keep warm?
Well, I'm not saying there is no such thing as a poor pensioner, but the overall scheme of pensioner poverty has been absolutely transformed, in the last 10
But it's clearly not enough.
We have one of the lowest state pensions in Europe, and the Tories have scrapped the triple lock as well, which was protecting the rate of that pension.
But it still protects against inflation. The double lock now exists, and inflation is protected.
It's not the triple lock that you went on in the manifesto, though.
But that would have led to an unfair windfall on pensioners, because that was the rate of earnings. It was the rate of the winter. That's not fair. The rate of earnings, which increased by 8% last year because of the effect on the labour market of the pandemic, would have meant that the state pension would have gone up 8%, and taxpayers would have to have funded that increase at a time when people had job insecurity.
So that would have been more than fair. The inflation is running at 9%. It's going to get higher. Hard-working
families struggling with 2 children, job insecurity during the pandemic, have to fund
and should also get protected as well.
So I think that the right assessment was
it's not against one against the other. Everybody.
So everyone needs to be protected all of the time during every crisis. I've just asked it, so there's no limit.
What the Chancellor did during the pandemic was to get lots of money out the door, and that didn't cover everybody. Lots of people were excluded from that support, but it covered lots of people and it was supported. So I want to know, really, from the Tories, why that crisis was worthy of protecting people, but this crisis isn't.
Just briefly, Patrick, do you think it's going to change people's view politically, rising inflation like this? We haven't seen it for such a long time in terms of their priorities when it comes to politics.
Yeah, I think you can tell from the debate around this table that it really kind of puts up the heat on politics, and you have different groups fighting over a smaller cake. Now, the classic Tory answer to that is to try and get economic growth and entrepreneurialism going. But I again think politically, yes, it's a short-term cost of living emergency for a lot of people. But if the Conservatives forget about occupational pensioners, say in their early 60s on quite good occupational pensions, if they're seeing for more than a year ahead, 8, 9, 10% inflation eroding their retirement dreams, that's a major factor that could take a huge block of votes that have served the Tories very well away from them.
Let's talk about something else. This headline on the story in The Telegraph: new boats scrambled to pick up Channel migrants as Rwanda one-way ticket fails to stop surge. This is the story that the Border Force has reportedly had to deploy ferry-style vessels to pick up Channel migrants, making that dangerous crossing, despite the government's plans to resettle people arriving on the UK shores and moving them immediately or deporting them straight to Rwanda. Over the weekend, 500 people continued to arrive in small boats. So, Laura, do you think this Rwandan immigration policy is not working as an effective deterrent?
Well, I don't think the Rwandan immigration policy has properly started, because I don't think anybody's gone to Rwanda yet.
Do you have faith in it still?
Well, I think it has to be given a chance to go, and I think it needs 6 months over the summer months, which is when we know that the principal small boat crossings happen, to assess whether or not it's going to work. I mean, I think what I would say about it is when you look at the number of small boat crossings at the end of 2021, so at the height of the pandemic, when we know that people weren't doing the lorry crossings, that there were more small boat crossings, it was 8,000. In the last 12 months, it has been 28,500. So we have to concede there is a business model that the people smugglers have been able to successfully exploit by driving up numbers by 20,000 in a year. And this is obviously a significant new approach to break that business model. And I think you can judge it, Jo, fairly in about 6 months' time.
Do you agree, Alison?
I think this model was always going to fail. It is.
What, you don't want to give it a chance at all?
I don't think it's fair or just or humane to take people who have come from war-torn countries, who have been exploited, who have been trafficked, who have seen their families murdered. I don't think it is fair in any sense to put them on a plane to Rwanda and never look at them again and never allow them to come here. Lots of people come to this country because they already have family ties here. They come here on boats because there is no other safe route to get here. The only way you can
there are some
very limited,
safe routes, but
very limited routes for people from Ukraine, for people from Afghanistan, for people from Hong Kong. I had around 80 families in my constituency who had relatives in Afghanistan. Only a handful of those were able to get their families over because those safe and legal routes do not exist. So people are forced to take these dangerous journeys on boats because it is the only way they can get home to their families, to safety, to a place away from the tyranny of the Taliban and everything else. There is no safe and legal route for many, many of those people. And I find it incredibly difficult and incredibly distressing to deal with those families because there is literally no information and no help from the UK government to do that.
Laura?
Because you can only claim asylum on arrival in the UK. If you were able to do those kinds of things from abroad, then that would take those small boat crossings out at a stroke. You wouldn't need to have them because everything would already be processed and people could come and be safe with their families and go on with their lives.
I'll come back to you in a moment, Patrick.
Well, I don't think it would take them out of the stroke because there's absolute advantage to physically getting to the UK, and many of the people, young men, 75% plus young men in a safe country already. The idea that safe routes would cure this, well, what's the criteria for who is allowed in under a safe route? I assume there's got to be some cap on numbers, because if we look at the Ukraine situation, for instance, one of the main reasons Michael Gove had to come up with this ingenious thing for individual people to take Ukrainians into their homes was we've got 35,000 plus backlog of people who've come across the channel in hotels. The normal capacity the British state would use
because
isn't
the UK
available.
Government hasn't invested in staff in UK VI. I have huge backlogs of casework in my constituency, people who have been waiting for years, not for a decision, for an interview with the Home Office, because they don't have the staff to process
We're already seeing...
And then you've got the UK Government saying they want to cut 90,000 jobs in the civil service.
But as
the
Laura
system
was
is creaking and broken because nobody has invested in it.
The volumes trebled last year. They're already running this year 3 times what they were in last year,
because
which in itself was a record volume. So we can clearly see the policy isn't working yet in terms of there was a brief hope that even mention of the policy would prove a deterrent. We clearly need to see implementation of the policy, and we cannot, as an overcrowded country with a housing stock massively under pressure, public services under strain, just accept what is a de facto right to migrate to Britain from any poor country in the world.
Dahlia?
You know, recently we've been talking about, with the Roe v. Wade stuff in the US, we were talking about abortion. And one thing we heard a lot was you can't change the number of abortions that happen. You can just change the conditions under which abortions take place. The exact same thing is true for displacement. You cannot change the number of people who flee their conditions when their conditions are no longer tenable for them. All you can do is change the conditions under which they move. And the government has decided that they will make those conditions as dehumanising, as harmful, as traumatising as possible. We've already done the experiment on offshore detention centres has already taken place. But
remember,
Australia.
This is different to offshore detention centres that were actually established in Australia. This is about moving people straight to Rwanda. They're not going to be looking at their asylum applications offshore and then coming back to the UK. They will resettle, is the idea, in Rwanda, just so that people understand the policy.
Yeah, but the offshoring of detention in this way, with that caveat, is a way of offshoring responsibility and accountability. And that is why we tend to see an uptick and systemic implementation of harm and trauma in these kinds of systems.
What would you say to people who sort of echo what Patrick was saying, is everybody an asylum seeker? Now, certainly the figures indicate that the vast majority are, but not all. Some are economic migrants. And is there a limit to the number of people who can come here and settle here?
Well, I think the idea that public services are under strain because of migrants, because of refugees, well, border controls are the strongest they've ever been, and yet the public services are completely crippled. So clearly increasing border controls doesn't enrich public services. Public services are crippled because the government has crippled them. It's not because of migrants, it's not because of refugees. They're just a useful scapegoat. And that's why we have to continue this anti-migrant sentiment, because otherwise who is left to blame for our crippling public services?
It is? They've become a useful scapegoat for failing government policy?
No, I think what the government is seeking to do is to draw a distinction between legal and illegal points of entry to the UK. And if I can just make the point, for example, with the Homes for Ukraine scheme, it is a scheme that hasn't had any designation on the total number of Ukrainians who can come here. The doors are open to anyone from Ukraine. The issue I would say about the small boat crossings, I take issue a bit with what Alison said, and one of the issues is ascertaining who's making the crossing, and I don't accept that everybody is escaping war. I don't accept that. When we heard on the Home Affairs Select Committee from Dan Omani, who does Border Force Command, he talked about the people smugglers' direction, which is made to everybody who makes that crossing, that they must dispense of all pocket litter in the channel, including their phone. So at the point of arrival, there is nothing that could identify them that would otherwise inhibit them making an asylum claim. Now, that's part of the business model and what they're told to do, but that does suggest something that is less than straightforward, one might say. The other point is that the Home Secretary has said that not everybody will be repatriated to Rwanda. I think it's fair to say she's kept it deliberately vague because she doesn't want to give the people smugglers the opportunity to know what the system is, and I think there'll be a degree of unpredictability.
Or she hasn't worked out the policy yet.
I think she's worked out the policy, but she's not going to
let her finish and then I'll come back to
the people smugglers that this category of person won't go.
It's impractical to send 28,000 people to
but that's not the point, Alison, and you know it. The point is to stop the small boat crossings and to encourage safe and legal points of access. And it does also, just one other small point I would make, I do, of course, take the points that you're making about refugees, but it is a question that that others have struggled to answer. If you're escaping war and conflict, why would you not seek asylum in France? Why would you not do that? It's a safe country in the EU, and I just,
Because perhaps all of your family that haven't been murdered are living here.
Yeah, I think this is a really important question, because when we understood, when you become a refugee, your life and your personhood doesn't stop. You deserve to settle in a place where you feel, for example, maybe you have the language, thanks to British Empire. Maybe you have a sense of, you understand the culture. We understood this with Ukrainian refugees. We understood that Ukrainian refugees have the right to decide where they are going to settle.
Although other European countries have taken far more and far more Ukrainian refugees, so that doesn't quite stack up with why they would want to come here particularly.
Why can't we afford that same dignity to people who, and I'm going to say it, and I wish I didn't have to say it, aren't read by us as white? Why do we understand that Ukrainian refugees have a right to settle here if they want to, even if they could go to a safe neighbouring country?
I don't
have that.
Well, it's a it is a legitimate question.
Well, I don't think that racialising of everything stacks up in this case. For instance, the Hong Kong BNO passport holders, again, it's a completely uncapped scheme. I would say an extravagant scheme, and I think Boris Johnson should have gone round Canada, Australia, other places and come up with an overall package. But to unilaterally say we'll take everyone who wants to come without a single extra house being built. This is the thing, our housing stock is so woefully inadequate, and we keep stoking up the population, and hundreds of thousands, more than 1 million people on social housing waiting lists are looking askance because people have to live somewhere and there aren't enough housing units to go around as it is.
All right.
But I'd also talk about the 20,000 Afghan refugees that are admitted. Some live in my constituency. They didn't jump the housing list, and I want to make that very clear. They have got houses that were basically
Britain did invade Afghanistan, so Britain did create those refugees, so it's the least you could have done.
But in terms of the question that you're saying that different types of refugees are treated differently on the basis of their skin colour, these are examples.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
It's my casework as well.
Plainly true.
All right, we are going to move on, talk about Nicola Sturgeon, Scotland's First Minister. She's been in the United States. She gave a speech there about the future of its security. Let's listen to what she said.
Coupled with a strong relationship with the United Kingdom, membership of the European Union and membership of NATO will be cornerstones of an independent Scotland's security policy. And so we are clearer than ever that membership of NATO would not only be vital to Scotland's security, although it would most certainly be that, it would also be the principal way in which an independent Scotland in an interdependent world would contribute to the collective security of our neighbours and allies.
Alison, how do you square wanting to join a defensive alliance, NATO, which is underpinned by nuclear capability, with wanting to remove one of its nuclear deterrents from your own territory?
I think we square that in exactly the same way that Sweden has done so. Sweden have...
but they're not removing what's already there.
No, but they are saying very clearly in their agreement with NATO that they put in today that they do not want nuclear bases on their shores at all.
Right, but you're still happy to be part of a defensive alliance that has nuclear capability at its very heart?
Because we see the importance of that defensive alliance.
Of the nuclear deterrent?
Not of the nuclear deterrent, and I'm very clear on my position on nuclear deterrence. I've campaigned out outside Faslane, and I have no plans to stop doing so.
But you're joining a defensive alliance that has nuclear weapons.
But the point of this is that all of the members of that alliance benefit from that collective defence. Sweden and Finland have seen that incredibly important. Those are two states who had prided themselves in a long history of neutrality, but due to the current geopolitical situation, have seen the importance and the significance of being part of that alliance. And Scotland as a country in our strategic location in the North Atlantic see that as well.
Well, I mean, the majority of countries in NATO don't host nuclear weapons. I mean, Alison is right. So why should Scotland if it becomes independent?
Well, what's happening here is Nicola Sturgeon wants to move Scotland from a position where it contributes actively within the UK to the NATO nuclear umbrella to taking a free ride under that nuclear umbrella, but without doing the kind of slightly gritty stuff of hosting the submarines. So the point I think is really important is the implications for the rest of the UK, because things like nuclear deterrent, where we've decided we want an independent one, and if you see what's happened to Ukraine, the only country ever to give up independent nuclear weapons, you see the importance of that. The rest of the UK can't be expected every 5, 6, 10 years to wait on another Scottish independence referendum in order to guarantee this long-term, if you like, geopolitical instance. So that's why I think it's very important that independence referenda like this happen once in a generation. And it means that because we've taken decisions to carry on putting most of our nuclear defence infrastructure in Scotland, partly based on the 2014 decision to stay within the United Kingdom.
Dolly, do you support the SNP's push, Nicola Sturgeon clearly setting it out or restating it, towards wanting to join NATO?
I can understand that given Russian aggression in Ukraine, I can understand why joining NATO would seem like something that would make Scotland safer. But I really do think that when you look at the broader historical context here, having these military alliances, creating these kind of games of nuclear chicken with one another, ultimately makes the world less safe. When you look, for example, some of the aggression that NATO has been involved in, Libya, Afghanistan, these are all interventions that not only created ongoing knock-on effects, such as the rise of ISIL, such as displacement crises. It also set a precedent of these illegal invasions that now Russia has continued to our horror. And so I think from a broad historical lens, demilitarising and pulling away from the scaling up of military engagement, including of nuclear weapons, and investing that money into, for example, Scotland is currently 1 in 4 kids are in poverty. That is actually a much better way of conferring a more meaningful form of safety and security for everyday people.
Well, I disagree. I think there's something in what you say about lowering the threshold for invading other countries have happened during the neocon era, and even if it's for the best of humanitarian intentions, certainly the Iraq invasion, the Libyan one, you can see that that's compromised the moral position of the West in this regard. But in terms of the idea that we just roll back from being well defended and having nuclear weapons, you just leave the baddest regimes to determine what happens on the ground. I don't think we can possibly do that. Laura?
The entire UK nuclear submarine infrastructure is based in Scotland. And the SNP have pledged to put an end to it if they achieve independence. We are at the most dangerous moment in global politics since the end of the Cold War, when the UK's nuclear umbrella has never been more critical. And there was a really good article written in the National Enquirer in the US by Professor Azim Ibrahim, who is one of Biden's foreign policy advisors, saying what he's been telling him, that if Scottish independence is achieved, it will blow a hole in the UK's 5 to 10 year nuclear defence strategy, and it will completely undermine the entire NATO alliance. So I think that there is an unbelievably difficult task that the SNP will have to perform to acquire membership of NATO, and I think that their stance on nuclear weapons, I have to say I have an interest because I represent the atomic weapons establishment in my constituency, where the only place in the United Kingdom where nuclear weapons are produced. I would argue, rather than being redundant, they keep us safe every day by the work that they do and the nature of the way that they inhabit the world. And I think it is absolutely nuts that the SNP is proposing to abolish them.
Alison,
completely
on that.
Consistent with what NATO's about.
It's certainly not. Most countries in the world don't have nuclear weapons, don't seek to have nuclear weapons. If it were the case that nuclear weapons made everybody safer, everybody would have them, and they don't, and they actively choose not to. And the SNP believe very firmly that these weapons cannot be used, because if you were to use them, as Russia has been threatening to do, you're on the brink of apocalypse already.
I'm going to pause us just there for a moment and welcome viewers from BBC News Channel to Politics Live. We have Prime Minister's questions coming up in just under 10 minutes' time. It'll be the first time Boris Johnson has faced Keir Starmer since those elections. I'm just going to continue with the conversation that we were having, which is about Scotland restating its position to rejoin NATO, but also the status of its nuclear deterrent. Here, I'll introduce our guests: Laura Farris, Conservative MP, Alison Thewlis for the SNP, Dahlia Gabriel, author and academic, and Patrick O'Flynn, commentator. Just continue what you were saying in terms of the SNP's position when it comes to getting rid of those nuclear submarines that are on Scottish territory.
Yeah, I was also going to pick up on a point that Dahlia made earlier as well about the choices that are tied up with nuclear weapons as well. They are outrageously expensive. That's money that you're not going to spend in a number of different ways. You could spend that on conventional defence. You could spend that on schools and houses and all the other things that where we were talking about earlier about public services needing investment. Those are all the kind of choices that exist. But if you tie this up in a new generation of nuclear weapons, that's going to continue sucking the budget of the UK for many, many decades to come.
I mean, that's a failure to understand what nuclear technological expertise involves. It's not just about, I went to the atomic weapons establishment about a month ago, and it was an extraordinary array of scientific brilliance. Some of the work they're doing there will go towards nuclear power stations, which are a critical part of our battle on climate change and getting us off fossil fuels. Some of the expertise they're delivering and some of their knowledge of geopolitics was like nothing I've ever really seen. What I didn't realise is that every single nuclear weapon the UK produces is accommodated on a Scottish-produced submarine. So Scotland, the SNP saying we'll get rid of the nuclear submarines is saying we will disarm the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom has to make a decision whether now, as I say, the most dangerous moment since the end of the Cold War, they could, or the Scottish people might need to make a decision. They want to live in a country that has no nuclear weapons and takes us, completely reduces our defence.
I mean, this should be an issue for the Scottish people to decide.
And they did.
And the English people,
if you don't mind,
and Welsh and Northern Irish.
Civil society in Scotland, the people in Scotland, have long protested against nuclear weapons being based in our country because we don't think they make us safer, they make us a target.
But why didn't they vote for independence in 2014?
Well, Glasgow did, and I was very proud that we did. And in 2014, for many people, yes, we didn't quite make that case. But since 2014, we've seen Brexit, we've seen all of the things that have happened in the world, and we've seen a UK government failing to stand up for the living standards of the people in Scotland too, by failing to act in this cost of living crisis. People in Scotland are not seeing the benefits of the union, and more on the doorsteps I'm chapping the doors of people who didn't vote yes in 2014.
Why is Westminster so scared of a Scottish
If the SNP is going to be able to, perhaps through a dodgy deal with Keir Starmer in a coalition rainbow, going to be able to deliver these regular referendums on secession, then the rest of the UK, and I would say the UK government now, has to think about transferring our technology for our independent deterrent and all those high-tech, high-paid jobs away from Scotland. It's not a viable long-term risk that a responsible UK government should be taking at all.
Dahlia, what were you trying to say there about why you think they're so scared?
Well, I guess that is my question. If you feel so comfortable in the will of the Scottish people, then what does it matter to you that there would be another referendum? What I want to say is we've gotten to this really bizarre scenario where we believe that flooding the world with nuclear weapons makes us less likely to have a nuclear war. In fact, it's the exact...
nuclear non-proliferation treaties, we have the test ban treaties.
In fact, it makes complete sense
by which you shouldn't be building more nuclear weapons under those treaties.
We should be starting to think about what the pathway towards a nuclear-free world could look like. Can it happen tomorrow? Of course not. But the first step to that is leaders like Nicolas Sturgeon beginning to normalise the idea that a nuclear-free world is possible. That is a bold stance.
By joining NATO.
Well, I don't agree that I don't agree that she should join NATO for that exact reason.
Well, that's clearly stated by you there. Let's talk to Vicki Young because, as I say, we've got 5 minutes before we have Prime Minister's questions. The BBC's Deputy Political Editor. Hello to you, Vicki. Just before we talk about the questions from Keir Starmer, a piece of news, the Tory MP who has been released on bail after being arrested on suspicion of sexual assault and rape. I know you can't say very much about it, but perhaps you could just bring us up to date.
Yeah, so this was an update from the Metropolitan Police today. And as you say, the man has been released on bail after initially being arrested on suspicion of indecent assault, sexual assault, rape, abuse of position of trust and misconduct in public office. Now, these offences are alleged to have taken place between 2002 and 2009. They were reported to the police in January 2020. Now, the MP has not been named, but Conservative Party whips are the people in charge of discipline within the party. They've asked him to stay away from the parliamentary estate while all of this is investigated. And it has prompted the unions, among others, to call for a change in the rules, saying that in some circumstances, MPs should be banned from the parliamentary estate, and that is a plea coming from the unions who represent many Commons staff. So that is now an investigation which is ongoing.
Thank you very much for that. Let's just go into the chamber, into the House of Commons. You can see MPs gathering there for Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer, the leader of the opposition, and the questions that he will pose to Boris Johnson. Vicki, I suppose cost of living is the most obvious area for Keir Starmer to prosecute the Prime Minister on.
Yes, I think so, and especially today with that latest news on inflation, which was expected, but nevertheless extremely shocking. And, you know, I think it is posing a real dilemma and a real challenge to the government over all of this. Now, They've hinted, haven't they, that they are going to come back with more help. A couple of weeks ago, I think the last Prime Minister's questions, Boris Johnson talked about more being said quite soon. That caused a bit of a flurry about was there about to be an emergency budget, which was then all dampened down by the Treasury. But I think there's no doubt, speaking to people in Whitehall, whether it's ministers, whether it's advisors, they all expect something to be coming. What we don't know is exactly what it is and when that is going to happen. But certainly when it comes to the idea of a windfall tax, something put forward by the opposition parties, having initially sounded very, very cold about the whole idea. Actually now it sounds much more as if the government is leaning towards that. I think the interesting thing for people looking at all of this will be, well, how much might it raise? This is a windfall tax on the energy companies. How much might it raise? And crucially, who will it be directed at? I think that is the big, interesting political question, if you like, about how this Conservative government targets the help that it's going to give. It has offered some already, but if there was to be a new amount of money raised, where would it go? Would it be in uprating benefits, for example, or would it be pushed more broadly towards people? Because, of course, everybody is seeing this increase in their bills. But I think what is clear is that the kind of intervention we saw with COVID, a huge amount of help, billions and billions, hundreds of billions of pounds, it's not going to be on that level. And the Chancellor making very clear again today that he's not going to be able to protect everybody against all of this rise in prices.
Vicki Young, BBC's Deputy Political Editor. We're going to see you here in the studio after Prime Minister's questions, Vicki, with our other guests for some post-match analysis. As I say, I think the Speaker will no doubt be introducing Prime Minister's questions in just a moment. Laura, on the issue of timing, it sounds as if the Chancellor is going to come back at some stage before the summer and do something. What would your preference be?
I do agree with that, actually. I do think he's going to do that. I don't, as I say, I'm a backbencher and I'm not privy to anything.
No.
So I've said already that I'm quite open to a windfall tax. I also do think, actually, I'd like to see something done more on the national living wage. It was increased to £9.50. I think there is a case to go further on that, if I'm honest. And I also, as I say, I think, you know, as a backbencher, I think you're probably more involved in some of the discrete issues. And as I say, childcare, I think, is a huge cost for lots and lots of families. Certainly it gets raised with me a lot, and that's something I'll be pushing him on later today.
I mean, Alison, would that, for you, satisfy your concerns? Rishi Sunak comes back, let's say does do something around a windfall tax, more targeted help for those on the lowest incomes. And that, to some extent, they would look again in the autumn when there could be another rise in the energy price cap. Would that be enough?
But I think all of the measures that the government have taken so far have been half measures, have been not quite enough.
But would those be? I mean, I know I'm speculating, but it looks as if
there was some suggestion in one of your headlines of an increase using the Hope-Born Homes discount by £600.
And that's the discount that does help people who are in levels of fuel poverty.
You had the Chief Executive of Scottish Power saying £1,000 on bills. For people who are on prepayment meters, this is a huge concern because they're having to feed their meter right now. They're seeing increased costs right now. They can't wait until the autumn to get more money in.
Well, we're going to have to wait because Prime Minister is here. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I know that members across the House will want to join me in offering our best wishes to Rangers for this evening's match in Seville. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with the ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Steve McKay. The latest State of Ageing report reveals, Mr. Speaker, that last year in this country, 9,000 people over the age of 60 died because their homes were too cold. Will the Prime Minister give a guarantee that figure will be lower and not higher this time next year?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I think everybody has every sympathy with people who are facing difficulties with the cost of heating, and that is why the government has stepped up with an extra £9.1 billion, in addition to what we're doing with the cold weather payments and the warm homes allowance, Mr. Speaker. And we will continue to support people throughout the aftershocks of COVID, just as we did throughout the pandemic.
Jo Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Figures released from the Department of Education show that last year, once again, Lib Dem-run Sutton Council became the highest rejecter of children applying for education, health and care assessments in the country. Nearly half of children were rejected compared to the national average of just 23%. Can the Prime Minister outline how the SEND review will help children and their families of SEN get access to the education that they deserve?
Prime Minister. Yes, indeed. I thank him very much for his campaign, and he is completely right, Mr. Speaker. That's why we have an SEND review, and we will ensure that SEND children and young people can get access to the right support at the right place and the right time across the country.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I too send my best wishes to Rangers. It's quite an extraordinary story, actually, over the last few years for that football club. Mr. Speaker, a one-off tax on huge oil and tax profits would raise billions of pounds, cutting energy bills across the country. The Chancellor rightly says there are two camps on this. You're either for it or you're against it. But which camp does the Chancellor put himself in? He says, neither. Well, I'm in favour of it. The question for the Prime Minister is he for it, is he against it, or is he sitting on the fence like his Chancellor?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think I just remind the House that the right honourable gentleman struggled to define what a woman was. If he couldn't make up his mind on that point, Mr. Speaker, heaven help us. Look, this government is not in principle in favour of higher taxation. Of course not. But what we want to do, we don't want to put. Of course they love it. They love it, Mr. Speaker. They love putting up taxes. Oh, that's what. Dog spot. Labour meow. Labour puts up catches me out. Labour put up taxes. What we want to do is take a sensible approach governed by the impact on investment and jobs, Mr. Speaker. And that is the test of a strong economy. And it's by having a strong economy that we'll be able to look after people as we have done during COVID and as we will do in the aftershocks of COVID. And I'm proud to say, Mr. Speaker, that this week it was revealed that unemployment has come down to the lowest level since 1974. When I was 10 years old, Mr. Speaker. I don't know how old he was, but I was 10 years old.
Yes, Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, hang on. Last week he said, we'll have a look at it. Yesterday he voted against it. Anyone picking up the papers today would think they're for it, and now he says he's against it again. Clear as mud. To be fair, it's not like the rest of his cabinet know what they think either. The same day the Chancellor said it was something he was looking at, the Justice Secretary said it would be disastrous. The Business Secretary called it a bad idea, but also said he'd consider a Spanish-style windfall tax. 1 minute they're ruling it in, the next they're ruling it out. When will he stop the hokey-cokey and just back Labour's plan for a windfall tax to cut household bills?
Mr. Speaker, the Labour's plans are always and everywhere to raise taxes on business, and that's what they did. I remember him campaigning in 2019, Mr. Speaker, on the biggest taxes for business that this country has ever seen. That's their instinct. Now, look. This country and the world faces problems in the cost of energy, driven partly by COVID and partly by Putin's war of choice in Ukraine. And we always knew that there would be a short-term cost in weaning ourselves off Putin's hydrocarbons and in sanctioning the Russian economy. Everybody in this House voted for those sanctions. We knew that it would be tough. But I just want to tell the right honourable gentleman that giving in, not sticking the course, would ultimately be the far greater economic risk. Yes, of course, Mr. Speaker, we will look We will look at measures. We will look at all the measures that we need to take, Mr. Speaker, to get people through to the other side. But, Mr. Speaker, the only reason we can do that is because we took the tough decisions that were necessary during the pandemic, which would not have been possible if we'd listened to him.
Keir Starmer.
He just doesn't get it, does he? He doesn't actually understand what working families are going through in this country, struggling about how they're going to pay their bills. And whilst he dithers, British households are slapped with an extra £53 million on their energy bills every single day. Meanwhile, every single day, North Sea oil and gas giants rake in £32 million in unexpected profits. Doesn't he see that every single day he delays his inevitable U-turn, is going to do it? He's choosing to let people struggle when they don't need to.
Mr. Speaker, he says that this government has no sympathy for people who are struggling and working. Let me tell you, it is precisely. Well, let me tell you what we're already doing. We're already spending £22 billion. We're already helping people with the cost of living in any way that we can, Mr. Speaker. But the reason we can do that is because we took the tough decisions to get this country through COVID, to make sure that we came out of lockdown in the way that was necessary, and to have a strong economy with robust employment growth, Mr. Speaker. And we will continue to take. And he talks about cutting taxes. In July, we will have the biggest tax cut for 10 years, £330 cuts for 30, on average, for 30 million people who are paying national insurance contributions. And the reason we can do that, Mr. Speaker, is because we have a strong and robust economy. I'm going to look at all measures in future to support our people. Of course I am. But the only reason we can do that, the only reason our companies are in such robust health, is because of the decisions that this government has taken.
Mr. Speaker, still pretending the economy is booming, still got his head in the sand in the middle of an economic crisis. The Prime Minister keeps saying more help is coming, but we've heard it all before. May the 13th, he stood there and said, "We will do more right now." A week has passed and there's been nothing. On April the 19th, he stood there and said, "We will do more as soon as we can." A month has passed and still nothing. The Chancellor said wait until the autumn. At least he's honest that the plan is to do nothing. But doesn't the Prime Minister realise that working people across the country can't afford to wait while he vacillates? It's time to make his mind up.
I'll tell you what's happened in the last month. We've got 300,000 more people off welfare and into work on our way to work programme, Mr. Speaker. And it is because we get people into work that those families, those people are £6,000 a year better off. It's by getting people into work that we fix the long-term problems of this economy. His answer, Mr. Speaker, his answer, in addition to putting up taxes, his answer is to borrow more. We heard it from the Shadow Chancellor this morning. She says she wants to borrow almost another £30 billion. That's what she says. Now, do you know what that means, Mr. Speaker? It means more pressure on interest rates. It means pressure on mortgages. It means pressure on every family, every man, woman and child in this country, Mr. Speaker. That's Labour economic policy. That is why there's never been a Labour government that left office with unemployment lower than when it came in. And that's the reality.
Mr. Speaker, on the day when inflation went to 9%, the highest for 40 years, I think the watching public, the least they can expect is a Prime Minister who concentrates on the cost of living crisis. Clearly, he just can't make his mind up. So let's have a look at who's for it and who's against it. On one side, the chair of Tesco, the chair of John Lewis, the chair of the Treasury Select Committee, the chair of the Education Select Committee, Lord Hague, Lord Brown, the old CEO of BP, all support a windfall tax. Even the current boss of BP says it wouldn't discourage investment. And on the other side, the member for North East Somerset. When he's not when he's not sticking notes on people's desks like some overgrown prefect, is dead set against it. When is he finally going to get a grip, stand up for the people of Britain and get on the right side of the argument?
Mr. Speaker, nothing could be more transparent from this exchange than their lust to raise taxes on business. Mr. Speaker, we don't relish it. We don't want to do it. We don't want to do it. Of course we don't want to do it. We believe in jobs and we believe in investment and we believe in growth. And as it happens, the oil companies concerned are on track to invest about £70 billion into our economy over the next few years. They're already taxed, Mr. Speaker, at a rate of 40%. Mr. Speaker, what we want to see is investment in the long-term energy provision of our country, which they've signally failed to do, by the way, cancelling our nuclear power investment. He talks about the people who are suffering from high energy prices in this country today, Mr. Speaker, have previous Labour governments to blame for that mistake. And of course, we will look at all sensible measures, Mr. Speaker, but we will be driven by considerations of growth, investment and employment. And I just remind you, Mr. Speaker, that unemployment's now hit a record low, or for 50 years, I should say, and employment is now I think 500,000 people more now in paid employment, payroll employment, than there were before the pandemic began.
So he's on the side of excess profits for oil and gas companies. We're on the side of working people. And there you have it. But he clearly doesn't like me pushing him on this. But the reason I keep coming back to this subject and why it's so frustrating that he hasn't acted is because so many people are living through this nightmare and they feel totally abandoned by their government. This week, I spoke to Phoenix Halliwell. A rare kidney condition means Phoenix has to do dialysis from home 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. for 5 days a week, just so he can take his daughter Rosie to school. His dialysis is life-saving, so he can't turn it off. So even though his wife, who's a midwife in the NHS, works extra shifts, during the winter, they had to turn their central heating off, and Phoenix skips meals to make ends meet. But their energy bill has still doubled. Phoenix says he feels like he's being priced out of existence. And it's not just him. Millions of our disabled, elderly, and vulnerable neighbours are at the sharp end of this crisis. They simply can't afford to live with dignity. The decisions we make here matter. The cost of indecision is enormous. People across the country need action now. The plans are already there. The Prime Minister, stop the delay. Work with us to put them in place. Do it for households that face bills they can't afford. And do it for Phoenix, who simply can't afford to wait.
Mr. Speaker, I'd be grateful if you could send me the details of the sad case, because the NHS does cover the costs of those who are on dialysis, Mr. Speaker. But if you send me, and by the way, of course, they voted against the vital investment in the NHS that this country needs. And I just remind him in the House of the key point. None of this is possible. The investment in the NHS isn't possible. The £22 billion that we've already put in isn't possible. The further investment that we're going to put in isn't possible without the strong economy that this government and this country has delivered. And it's because we took the tough decisions that I have mentioned that we have record low unemployment. Record low for the last 50 years, Mr. Speaker. And this Queen's speech that we've been debating is about putting in the infrastructure, the skills, the technology that will continue to build the platform for growth and jobs in this country. And that is what this government is committed to doing, and that is the best way out of economic problems. And I thought it was fantastic, by the way, yesterday to see Her Majesty the Queen open Crossrail. 72,000 jobs that has already delivered, 90 billion it will produce for the whole of the UK economy. Well, let me just ask the right honourable gentleman, who was the Mayor of London when Crossrail was first started to be built? Mr. Speaker. And who was the Prime Minister who completed it, Mr. Speaker? We get the big things done, Mr. Speaker. There's never been a Labour government that left office with unemployment lower than when they began.
Mr. Speaker, as the Prime Minister knows, thanks for visiting us in Leyland a couple of weeks ago, as he knows, knocking on doors there, crime and antisocial behaviour is a big issue for people locally. And part of that problem is that the local police, when response calls are required, are having to come in from Preston or the lovely Chorley. Now Lancashire has got 314 more police, thanks to this government. Yeah. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that we need to use some of those to get Leyland Police Response open? And will he work with me, the fabulous local police and the Police and Crime Commissioner to make that happen?
Minister. Well, I thank my honourable friend. She's a terrific campaigner, fantastic campaigner for her constituency. I discovered just the other day. And what we're doing is recruiting more police officers. 300 more in Lancashire, 13,576 more across the whole of the country, and of course. I'd be very happy to arrange the relevant meetings so that we can continue to drive neighbourhood crime, already down 33%, drive neighbourhood crime down even further.
Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm sure the whole House will want to join me in wishing Glasgow Rangers Football Club all the best in their final tonight in Seville. It's always a joy to see Scottish clubs get to the finals of European competition. Mr. Speaker, people didn't need to see this morning's official statistics to know that we're experiencing the highest inflation in 40 years. They know it because they're living with it. Families can't afford food. They can't pay their bills. And we're only at the beginning. And as always under the Tories, the poorest are punished the most. For months, people have been crying out for support. But month after month, a distracted Downing Street has failed to lift a finger to help. Does the Prime Minister still support his Chancellor's insulting statement that acting now in this cost of living emergency would just be silly?
Sure. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I support the Chancellor's work in lifting the living wage by a record amount, Mr. Speaker, by making sure people on universal credit pay £1,000 less in tax, by making sure that by putting another £22 billion into supporting people with the cost of living, 9.1 billion already to help people with the cost of energy, and above all, I support what he has done to deliver a strong economic foundation which makes all that possible, Mr. Speaker.
My goodness, talk about an Aesop's fable. Every day this Prime Minister remains out of touch, people remain out of pocket. And by the way, Prime Minister, £20 a week was taken out of people's universal credit. You know, the Prime Minister's just confirmed he does think it would be silly to intervene. Because the Tories' only response to this cost of living crisis has been insults and inaction. The Tory backbencher who thinks poor people, just need cooking lessons. The Tory minister who thinks that people should just get a better paid job. And the Chancellor who thinks it would be silly to act now. This is the cost of living crisis from Westminster. For weeks, the Prime Minister has been briefing that it's the Treasury who are to blame for blocking financial support for struggling families. Well, Prime Minister, it's time to stop sniping from the sidelines. If this Chancellor won't deliver an emergency budget, it's time for the Prime Minister to sack the Treasury, to sack the Chancellor and to put somebody else in office that will act.
Prime Minister.
Look, Mr. Speaker, I think that the right honourable gentleman should understand that I want to get back to the crucial point. We've been through COVID. We're facing a spike in global energy prices, which has been greatly exacerbated by what Putin is doing in Ukraine. But to deal with it, of course, what we're doing is putting billions and billions already, 9.1 billion into supporting people with the cost of energy. cut fuel duty by record sums, Mr. Speaker, helping elderly people in all sorts of ways, not least through local councils with another £1 billion. But of course, Mr. Speaker, everybody in the country knows that we're not through this yet, and everybody can see that. And they all know that the government is going to do more. But they also know the only reason we can do that is because we have a strong economy with massively high employment, and that is the crucial thing. And it would not have been possible if we'd listened to the members opposite. Absolutely.
Dr. Luke Evans.
The Prime Minister will be aware of my campaign to have digitally altered images carry a label. Last week was Mental Health Awareness Week, and there are 1.25 million people with eating disorders and 1 million people using steroids. Now, 84 members of this House from 7 parties signed my open letter to companies to pledge not to alter their images in their adverts. Will the Prime Minister support that pledge? And for those who aren't taking that pledge, will he vow to make sure that we consider labelling digitally altered images where body proportions are affected?
Minister. Look, I thank my honourable friend for his fantastic campaign, and he and I have talked about it at length. And I do think there is clearly a risk to mental health as young people are given unrealistic expectations about how they should look because of the stuff that they see. I think the kite mark suggestion that he's brought forward is extremely useful, and I'll make sure that we follow it up as part of our mental health plan.
Ed Davey.
Can I join other new fans of Rangers and wish them good luck in Seville tonight? Mr. Speaker, British farmers are the best in the world. They could play a big part in the answer of how families and pensioners put food on the table during the cost of living emergency. But from Caithness to Cumbria, from Shropshire to Devon, farmers' own input costs are spiralling upwards. Animal feed up 60%, Mr. Speaker. Fertiliser prices more than doubled. Yet instead of helping Britain's own food producers, the government is slashing the support payments that farmers rely on, sometimes for up to 50% of their income, even before a new scheme is in place. So will the Prime Minister meet with farming leaders and myself to understand the extreme challenges they are facing so our farmers can do their bit to help families and pensioners afford to put food on the table during this economic crisis?
Prime Minister.
I thank the right honourable gentleman. I can tell him that yes, I do recognise the challenges that farmers are facing with the costs of their inputs in fuel and in fertiliser, and that's why we're working so hard to abate those costs. But what we've also got to do, and not just cutting duty, but everything else that we can do to ensure that we fix the energy crisis. But what we're also doing, Mr. Speaker, is championing UK food and farming, which has fantastic export markets around the world, and now has 70 free trade deals to exploit in a world avid, as he rightly says, for delicious, wholesome, nutritious UK food and drink. And I'd be very happy to organise the relevant meeting with the right honourable gentleman.
Julie Marston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend join me in thanking my constituents in Hertford and Stortford, who are offering help and refuge to Ukrainians suffering from and fleeing the Russian invasion? And can he set out how his visit to Sweden and Finland ensured closer cooperation with our allies to secure the long-term stability and security of Europe, as my constituents are rightly concerned about ongoing Russian aggression?
Minister.
I thank her very much. I want to thank her constituents very much for what they're doing to help Ukrainians fleeing war and aggression. And I know that members up and down the country have constituents who are being incredibly generous. I think we can all be proud of the UK's efforts. Yes, Mr. Speaker, it's true that the UK signed historic declarations the other day with Sweden and Finland to reinforce our security, our mutual security, and to fortify Europe's defences. And I think it has been a massive step change in our cooperation, a thoroughly good thing, and it has been driven, Mr. Speaker, in the cases of both Sweden and Finland, by the people themselves who see the logic of NATO membership.
Mr. Brandishaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Home Office, Health and others now regularly take 6 months to respond to letters to ministers. Immigration cases wait years to hear anything at all. But instead of putting resources into fixing this unacceptable problem, the Prime Minister is choosing to fire thousands of civil servants. And his ministers wander around Whitehall putting post-it notes on desks he thinks looks too empty. Will the Prime Minister personally look into this issue and instruct his ministers and civil servants to give our constituents the attention they deserve?
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much, but I have to say that, Mr. Speaker, I must respectfully disagree with the implication that for the civil service that working from home is everywhere as productive as being in the office and returning. And I simply don't accept that. I do think that we will become more productive and more efficient if, on the whole, we find ways to get back to our desks.
Richard Holden.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Following my campaign, Wittenley Weir Primary School is now being granted £350 grand for improvement works by Durham County Council. The only time that this has happened is now, after Labour lost control of the council, the first time in over 100 years last year. Villarreal School, Ledgate Primary School and Concert Juniors in North West Durham are also going to be applying for the Condition Improvement Fund. So can I urge my honourable friend to ensure that those cases are taken as seriously as possible? But would my right honourable friend more broadly agree with me that education is a cornerstone of levelling up and ensuring more good jobs are available locally in County Durham too? So that it's more than just a place to bring friends for a social evening of beer and takeaway curry, and an even better place to live, work and bring up a family.
Sorry, Prime Minister, just I've got a real problem. Some people aren't going to get in. And we've seen the time now, and we're only on question 16. I wanted everybody to help each other. So we could speed up, we might get a few more in. Prime Minister.
Well, I just want to thank my honourable friend, who's a massive champion for his constituency for North West Durham, and I'm delighted that he's been a supporter of County Durham's bid for City of Culture, culture in its widest interpretation, and I support him in everything he does.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Prime Minister knows that this is Dementia Awareness Week, and I'm proud that the Dementia Research Institute now calls Wales home. In 2019, the Tory manifesto promised to double funding for dementia research, but the researchers are still waiting for this money. So, can the Prime Minister tell me, in this Dementia Action Week, when the Dementia Moonshot will be delivered?
Mr. Speaker, we intend fully to deliver the Dementia Moonshot, but never forget, Mr. Speaker, that this was the party that voted against £13 billion a year extra for the NHS.
Mr. Speaker, I know that I'm not alone in dealing with many constituents facing delays to renewing their passports and driving licences. In Goodling, there have been cases of family reunions in jeopardy and drivers nearly having job offers withdrawn because of delays to renewals. Can my right honourable friend assure me that everything is being done that is possible to be done in government to address this problem, so we can get the good folk of Goodling back on the road and away for their holidays?
Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'm told that the driving licences are now being issued faster than they were. There are I'm told, no delays in successful online driving licence applications, and the customers should receive their licence within a few days. Now, if I'm misinformed about that, Mr. Speaker, I trust my honourable friend will let me know.
Alex Sobel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, food prices are going up, rents are going up, energy costs are going up. every day I've got more and more constituents coming to me to say they thought the day would never come. Things just cost too much. At the same time, people are anchored to the minimum wage, working 2, 3, 4, 5 jobs on low wages, within work benefits. They just can't afford it. At the same time, we have the Minister, the Honourable Lady Member for Edgett, saying to survive they should take on more hours or get a better job. Does the Prime Minister agree with his Minister, or does he agree with me that we should have an emergency budget?
Minister. Mr. Speaker, I accept that, of course, there are economic pressures on our country now caused by the factors that we mentioned, but that's why we've already increased the living wage by £1,000 per year for those who are on it. Already increased universal credit by £1,000 a year. All the other measures, billions and billions of tax that we're putting into supporting incomes, Mr. Speaker. But the reason we can do that is because we have strong economic fundamentals with unemployment. I don't know when he was born, Mr. Speaker, but unemployment is the lowest it's been since 1974, and that is giving us the foundation to take our country forward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Airedale Hospital recently submitted its bid to be one of the government's new hospitals, and this is because the Airedale has an extremely high structural risk profile, with 83% of the building being constructed from aerated concrete. There are several wards that are closed due to structural risk, and the hospital is now over 20 years beyond its original life expectancy. So can the Prime Minister personally assure me that we will be able to deliver a new Airedale Hospital which is fit for the future?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, there's a lot of pressure on me to dish out yet another hospital from this dispatch box. But I can tell him that we're reviewing all applications for the next 8 hospitals in our new hospital programme, which is the biggest in a generation, Mr. Speaker. Only possible because we have a strong economy, Mr. Speaker, and we'll make he's a doughty campaigner for his constituents. We'll make a final decision later this year.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 26th of February, a private charter flight to Moscow was allowed to take off from Inverness Airport, an apparent breach of a UK ban on flights of that nature, which had come into effect from midnight the day before. Now, air traffic control transcripts published this week in the Press and Journal newspaper have revealed that despite being informed of the intended flight, no attempt was made by the UK government or its agencies to prevent the plane from taking off. Will the Prime Minister commit to informing the House at the earliest opportunity who was travelling on that flight, why, despite being informed in advance of the flight, was no attempt made by the UK government to keep the plane on the ground, and what will the Prime Minister personally do to try and prevent any similar breaches of sanctions from happening in the future?
I thank him very much. I'll make sure that as soon as we can get some, I don't know the answer to his question, but as soon as we can get some information about that, Mr. Speaker, I'll make sure the House is properly informed.
Andy Carter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this week, the Planning Inspectorate waved through a decision by Labour councillors to build a massive logistics hub in South Warrington. The plans are contrary to national policy, entirely in the Green Belt, and have been approved despite more than 1,000 letters of objection. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that listening to local communities and protecting our precious Green Belt must be at the heart of planning policy? And will he meet with me to see how local residents can have their voices heard?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, local residents could have no more powerful voice than that of my honourable friend. The House will have heard him loud and clear. I know the Ministry, Department of Levelling Up, will have heard him loud and clear. I will make sure that he gets the relevant meeting.
And the Bowdown.
No bullying and no harassment, no leaking, no misuse of taxpayers' money, and no actual or perceived conflicts of interest. The precious principles of public life enshrined in this document must be honoured at all time. Those, Mr. Speaker, are the Prime Minister's own words from the Ministerial Code. So can the Prime Minister tell me, on a scale of 1 to 10, how's he doing with keeping to those principles?
Mr. Speaker, I think 10 out of 10, Mr. Speaker, because what we believe in this government in adhering to the principles of the Ministerial Code, and by the way, it's an important point because, Mr. Speaker, there's a lot of attacks on MPs, on what goes on in this place, and I think it is always worth stressing that the vast majority of people who work in the House of Commons, members of Parliament, are doing a very good job and working very hard and are not misbehaving.
Idle question, Kevin Hollinray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thurska Molson has welcomed asylum seekers from all parts of the world, including Syria and the Ukraine. But the government's plans just announced from the 31st of May to the start of what will be up to 1,500 non-detained young single males from different parts of the world, asylum seekers, on a base that will be the centre of a small rural village of 600 people, children, all the way through to elderly residents. That village without streetlights, without police presence. It will devastate the community. It will devastate house prices, which will plummet. And the residents of that village will not feel safe to leave their homes alone. Will my right honourable friend please, on behalf of the community, please stop these plans?
Prime Minister.
I thank him. I thank him very much, and I know that my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, is engaging with him and with others locally about the use of the site, and I hear loud and clear what he has had to say. Indeed, I'm the recipient of many of his intercessions on this matter, and I understand the strength of feeling in his constituency, and I'm sure that there will be further meetings between him and the Home Office about what we can do.
That ends questions. We're going to let it clear while...
As the Speaker has said, that does end this week's Prime Minister's Questions, the first since the elections. Let me welcome our guests for this part of the programme. Simon Hart for the Government, the Welsh Secretary, Pat McFadden for Labour, Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and Vicki Young has joined us here in the studio, the BBC's Deputy Political Editor. Welcome to all of you. Unsurprisingly, Keir Starmer's questions were all about the cost of living and specifically why Boris Johnson and the government is not yet announcing that they will back their policy, Vicki, of a windfall tax on profitable oil and gas companies. What did you make of it?
Well, I think it's interesting because I think the government has got itself in a tangle over all of this. It's certainly the case that some help has been given. There's no doubt about that. We've had the, cut in fuel duty. There's a rebate on council tax for some people, and then there's this loan effectively to help with bills. But that is all getting lost, actually, in the attack on the government about not doing enough. Now, it was interesting today, Boris Johnson saying everyone knows that the government is going to do more, and then equally on the issue of a windfall tax saying, of course, we don't want to do it. So the question is he going to end up with a U-turn, which is what of his own MPs think, and then actually you don't get the political gain from that because it looks like you've been dragged towards doing it. Now, instinctively, there are lots of Conservatives who certainly don't want a windfall tax. Now, Margaret Thatcher did do one on the banks, so it's not something that hasn't been done before by Conservative governments, but they could end up coming forward with something and not actually getting much plaudits for it. So I think that is the problem they've got. The timing on it, we don't know. Certainly, if you speak to people in Whitehall, you speak to ministers, MPs, everyone thinks the government's heading towards a windfall tax. What would it be? How much would it raise? And I think most importantly for people watching, aside from the politics of this, who will it be directed at? That's a big, big question, I think, for the Cabinet, as to where will any extra help be directed? Will it go into tax cuts, which, of course, tend to help everybody, or will it be more directed at those who need it?
All right, well, let's ask a minister here. Do you like the idea of a windfall tax? Have you come round to it now?
I tell you what I've really come to believe in the last few days is we're all relying far too heavily on this being some kind of magic, magic cure for a very complicated problem. We heard all of the arguments this morning, and I think Vicki Young is right. Nobody in the Conservative Party ever wants to sort of cheerfully go down the road of tax rises. Same with the pandemic. We only do these things because we actually have to. We want to return to a low-tax economy. But you also heard the PM. You also heard the PM say the equivalent of nothing is ruled in, nothing is ruled out. So he's keeping all the options open.
Right, but you are sitting here now. He has confirmed. We just heard the Prime Minister say the government is going to do more. What is it you're waiting for? We already know that families are struggling to pay bills, people on fixed incomes, people who cannot find, beyond the help that the government has set out, those extra hundreds of pounds that are going to have to be found to help pay for rising food prices as well as energy. What is stopping you taking the action now?
I'm really conscious that in government nothing ever happens as much or as fast as people wanted it. There are good reasons sometimes why these things take a while. The Treasury, and I think what Rishi Sunak has proved, and I hope we can all agree on that during the pandemic, is the fact that actually the Treasury can move fast. He's already introduced 22 billion.
He moved immediately when it came during COVID. So what's stopping him coming back with a windfall tax?
There's £2 billion worth of taxpayers' money already being aimed at families in the greatest need. There's more tax cuts coming in July, the national insurance threshold. That's going to benefit, I think, up to about 30 million people to the tune of 300.
All right.
But I think it is right. I hope people understand. I think it is right that we look at these things, every hour, every day, of every week.
But I still haven't heard, are you minded now for that windfall tax to happen on oil and gas companies to help people pay their bills?
Well, none of us want to go down that road. But all I'm saying is that I think just to say, it would be so easy for me to just sit here and say, yeah, here's a simple thing. The whole problem will be resolved. We're just going to tax some oil companies, some extra, and the problem will go away. That's how Keir Starmer's framing it. That isn't correct. Nobody with any degree of sort of financial literacy believes that to be the case.
Oh, well, financial literacy, is that your strong point, Pat?
Well, we've been calling for this since the turn of the year. We could see this cost of living crisis coming, particularly on energy bills. This is a classic windfall situation. The oil and gas companies haven't done anything new or special to enjoy the enormous profits that were announced 2 weeks ago. And a windfall levy like that wouldn't make all the problems go away.
Right, so you agree with Simon on that?
But it would get extra help, particularly to the poorest people. We calculate that this, with other measures, could take £600 off energy bills this year.
Not for everybody.
That's not for everyone. For people on the lowest incomes.
Right.
£200 for everyone else. So this would get real help to people on the issue that's driving those inflation figures up the most.
Right. The Prime Minister said in this session that Labour's plans overall would add £30 billion of extra additional borrowing. He's right, isn't he?
I'm not sure what he was referring to.
Was he referring to the 28 billion extra a year in borrowing for climate change policies?
We want to invest in the climate change. This is a necessary transition, and if we don't make the investment, the OBR has said the long-term costs of not acting will be even greater.
Right, but you are going to add that additional borrowing. Those are part of your plans.
That is part of our plans.
Escalating borrowing like that is going to drive up, potentially drive up interest rates and inflation. So any of the interventions we've already announced and we talked about will be completely undone by that kind of...
It's a little bit rich, isn't it, of Boris Johnson there at the dispatch box to accuse the Labour Party of, as he said, Labour's lust to raise taxes, that Labour has historically been the party of high taxes. Which party has just increased our taxes in terms of national insurance contributions?
We don't believe in a high borrowing, high taxation
except you're
economy.
Doing it.
Yeah, but out of absolute necessity, at a time of international crisis, it is not unreasonable to have to take some measures with the view of returning to a low tax economy at the earliest opportunity. I think that's where the dividing line is.
Right, but it is a bit rich to accuse them of being a high tax party at this particular moment, isn't it?
It's a traditional difference between the two parties. There's nothing unusual or incorrect about what
Can I just come in on this? There may be a point that it's a traditional difference, but the actions that the Chancellor has taken to increase the tax burden to the highest level we've seen since the 1950s and to play this ridiculous hokey-cokey game that we've got going on between national insurance and income tax have destroyed the Conservatives' claim to be the low taxation party.
Right, but actually, Pat, you said something similar when you were last in the studio with me about the money that's going to be raised by these national insurance contributions, the increase in national insurance contributions. You said it would be wiped out because of the increase in the threshold at which people start to pay those contributions. But actually, that's not true, is it? Well, not according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies. They've calculated that the increase in NICs in 22-23 will still raise £11 billion in revenue overall, taking into account the lifting of the thresholds. So do you want to correct that?
No, there's two things we need to look at here. First of all, the Chancellor claimed that it would raise 12 billion a year for the NHS and social care. He then gave 6 back. With this raising of the thresholds. That's what he said in his spring statement.
Yeah, but he's still raising £11 billion a year. The Institute for Fiscal Studies have still said, you're right, it was a higher amount, but they are still raising £11 billion,
the other
even
part
though
of the
they're
picture,
lifting
Joe,
it.
the other part of the picture is the promise to cut income tax in 2 years' time.
That's in 2 years' time.
Before the
So
election.
do you accept for the next 2 years that it will raise £11 billion?
It will raise an amount for the next 2 years.
Right, and how would you do that? How would you pay for that money for the NHS?
We are not going to come in with a replacement tax when he has given £6 billion back now. He's promising £5 billion back in 2 years' time. Why should working families have to pay increased tax this year just so that Rishi Sunak can make a pre-election tax cut promise?
That is, as I say, in 2 years' time. But it is not correct, as you will accept, to say that that money isn't going to be raised at all, according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies.
We never claimed it would raise nothing. We claimed that he had given £6 billion back this time and £5 billion back in a pre-election tax cut.
But what you won't say is how you would raise that money for the NHS and the pandemic recovery yourselves.
We do not accept that the Chancellor had to go ahead with the next rise. His proceeds from other taxes are bigger than expected. Take stamp duty, for example, £6 billion more than was expected last year. They are raising more in tax receipts. And by the way, they're already briefing that they might bring forward that promised income tax cut from 2 years' time, which will increase the hokey-cokey aspect.
Hang on, I've already taken Pat through this. Vicki, let's say when Simon next comes into the studio, hopefully very soon, the Prime Minister's already announced we're going to have a windfall tax on oil and gas companies. Will people remember whose policy it was in the first place?
Well, this is the interesting thing about this. Obviously, we look at the politics of it and you can see that they've got themselves in a bit of a mess about it. You've got ministers going on air saying different things and having recalibrated how for or against a windfall tax that they are. But I do wonder when it comes to it whether people will just be very thankful for the money in whichever way it is finally given back to them. And I do wonder whether people will remember in the end whose policy it is. One thing to bear in mind, we have 2 by-elections coming up on the 23rd of June. If you are the Conservative government and you're going to decide to take action, and it's pretty clear that you might wait till the autumn, you might want to do it to get some political capital out of it.
Well, that won't be for the first time. Is that right?
I really think that people will wince if I say this. I really think this is too serious a situation for us to be factoring in election possibilities along the way. And Pat, he can't have it both ways. He's criticising us for raising tax and then say he's going to criticise us for cutting tax. Which is it that he wants us to do?
We're going to talk about the situation in Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Protocol, in just a moment. And I just want to welcome Neil Richmond, Irish MP, who has joined us now to talk about that. But before we get to it, Neil, Vicki, we were talking to you earlier about this story about the arrest of a Conservative MP who has been released on bail. Another Conservative MP has tweeted this: I'm expecting a strong turnout of Conservative MPs at Prime Minister's questions today, not only to demonstrate their strong support for Boris, but also to prove they are not the one told by the Chief Whip to stay at home. I will be there. It was linked to the story of that arrest. Has there been any reaction to that?
Yeah, there has. Now, just to be clear, it's because the Conservative whips, even though this Tory MP hasn't been named, the Conservative whips have said to him to keep away from the parliamentary estate. And that has brought about a bit of a debate about what happens in cases like this because, as you say, this man has been released on bail but has been arrested initially on suspicion of indecent assault, sexual assault, rape, abuse of position of trust, misconduct in public office. Very serious accusations, and so lots of people saying they shouldn't be allowed to come onto the parliamentary estate. And then the reaction to that is for people to say, look, this is not, this is, the emoji added to that as well. This is not this kind of thing you should be making these comments about, and this is incredibly serious. Obviously, there'll be lots of male Conservative MPs who couldn't be in the chamber today, and he's been asked to take down this particular post.
I mean, was that appropriate? We don't need to talk widely about exactly what's happened because, obviously, it's a criminal investigation, but what...
I would go further than Vicki Young has. I think it's idiotic, it's insensitive, and it attempts to make light of a really serious situation. I despair when I read stuff like that.
Fair enough. Neil Richmond. As you know, yesterday, the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, stood up in the House of Commons and said that it would be lawful to bring forward changes to the Northern Ireland Protocol in order to make changes that would satisfy the unionist community in Northern Ireland. This was the treaty and the agreement that was made with the EU to deal with trade from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. What did you make of her statement that it would be lawful to unilaterally act?
Well, first and foremost, we consider that to be false. We haven't seen the legal advice that she's been provided with, but we've been consistent through this that any breach of the Northern Irish Protocol through unilateral means would be a breach of international law, and that will come with very serious consequences. We haven't seen what she's actually saying in terms of detail of what she's proposing to do, but to be honest, beyond the legalities, the politics and the whole diplomacy of this is absolutely lousy.
Right, you say there'll be serious consequences. We also heard Simon Coveney saying something very similar. What response would that trigger? Because let's be clear, the legislation hasn't been tabled as yet, but certainly the plans have been set out. What response would that trigger, or should that trigger, from the EU?
Well, we've seen throughout this sorry Brexit process that the EU doesn't react irrationally. It takes its time, it ponders any moves by the British government. But already there's existing legal action that has been paused, taken by the European Commission against the British government. I'd imagine that would be unpaused. There is other legal matters that would no doubt be pursued. The legal analysis of the British government would obviously be contended, but ultimately it could lead to the collapse of the withdrawal agreement and indeed the trade deal that the EU has with the UK.
Are you prepared to risk that, Simon?
I'm listening carefully to those comments, and I think I haven't seen the legal advice either, by the way, but I trust the Attorney General, and I trust...
The Attorney General got second legal advice.
Say again?
But the Attorney General didn't trust the initial legal advice, and now she's got secondary legal advice.
But the comments were made yesterday. That's what's in the public domain. I haven't seen the legal advice either. But I think clearly the preference is to reach a negotiated settlement around this. That we still believe that is possible. We definitely believe it's still desirable.
Why then have you introduced these plans to try and change the protocol? Why not just rip it up?
I don't think it's unusual to run a sort of parallel legislative process, which is what's going on here. That doesn't compromise in any way the ability to reach a negotiated settlement. And as you rightly point out, the EU takes its time over this. We're attempting to push that along, try to keep the pace up as best we can. But the intention is to reach a negotiated settlement, which I think all of the parties concerned are anxious to see succeed.
Before we get to the politics of it, Neil, just at a practical level, this idea of checks, that there are checks, there were always going to be some checks down the Irish Sea when it came to the agreement to keep Northern Ireland closely aligned for goods to the EU for goods. Does there have to be that level of checks? We've seen the wodge of papers. It's burdensome. It is causing distress to businesses who are trading from GB to Northern Ireland. Don't you think that that could be something that could be minimised?
Absolutely, and that's why, speaking of taking time, Simon, the European Commission presented a very detailed paper in October after discussing with business and farming leaders in Northern Ireland that would help reduce the checks. It would make sure there was no legal impediment for Northern Ireland to import medicines in from GB. We want to do this. We want to do this through negotiation. We've been advocating for an EU-UK...
Yeah, but Maris Sefcovic has said very clearly, Neil Richmond, we're not reopening this negotiation. We're not going to look again at the treaty. That doesn't sound like someone who is prepared to look at this issue again.
But we don't have to reopen the treaty to diminish the amount of checks. That's the point. The British government has said, no, we have to riv it up. We've given up after a couple of months. We've looked at your proposals. We haven't proposed anything substantive in return. We have the opportunity to allow the negotiating teams go through this line by line. They haven't met since the 24th of February due to the war in Ukraine. The UK only changed its negotiator again in December. We haven't given this the full go. But what we see is the political one-upmanships of the Conservative Party coming before an international treaty.
There is an issue here between those who want to scrap the protocol completely, and of course that includes the DUP. This is why this has again become such a major issue because of power sharing, and those who are willing to tweak it or make changes to it, but not scrap it completely. And I think there's a difference in government. Some people in government have different views. There are certainly Conservative MPs who want it scrapped completely, as well as the DUP. And there are others who are just talking about, you know, the way it's implemented. They are two different things. And I think that is what is causing some of the problem here.
It's not just Neil Richmond and Simon Coveney and others in the EU who have criticised any potential unilateral action by the UK government. The former Conservative Prime Minister Theresa May did the same thing in the House of Commons. Do you agree with her? Why should the EU trust this government or its word when it comes to negotiating something that they did sign up to in 2019 in order to get Brexit done?
I think Theresa May is one of our most respected colleagues, was obviously very much central to this period of negotiation in history. But she has made her views very clear on the whole process. Very process. I don't share her view on this particular instance. I say that more out of sadness rather than anger.
But do you understand the sentiment about Boris Johnson and trusting?
Say again?
But do you share her sentiment about trusting Boris Johnson? It'd be difficult to trust the British government if they move towards any unilateral action of a treaty they've signed up to.
But I think that's to misunderstand. We should have learned this by now. I think that's to misunderstand the process of negotiations and the way that the pattern is normally followed. It misunderstands, I think, the ambitions, the shared ambitions we have here to reach a negotiated settlement. I don't think the existence of a legislative operation running parallel in any way compromises that. And I think you were right. The point is that the bureaucratic burdens that you referred to are absurd. They're clearly not working. We clearly need to go further than where we are at the moment. And I think there is still optimism that this can be achieved.
All right, optimism. But in the end, the politics that I was going to come to is about the Democratic Unionist Party that Vicki mentioned. They would like the whole thing ripped up. How would you get them back to power sharing, Neil Richmond? That is the priority for Sinn Féin. It's the priority for the British government, is to try and get power sharing restored at Stormont. How would you do it?
Two things. With respect to Simon, there's no misunderstanding on the European side of what's been going on from this British government after the last couple of years in terms of agreements that have been reneged upon. In terms of dealing with the DUP, we have to remember a very pro-Brexit party who have said no to every single solution throughout that Brexit has been presented.
But they feel separate. They feel Northern Ireland is being separated, Neil Richmond. If you had to get them back into government and power sharing, what would you do?
Well, I think that's the main thing is we actually want to see the North-South institutions restored. We want to see the British government come back into the negotiating table to agree an EU, UK-wide SPS agreement that gets rid of 85% of checks overnight.
Which is closer alignment, obviously, to the EU. Whose side are you on? You've got about 5 seconds.
We want a protocol to work and we want Britain to keep to its word.
All right, well, thank you for being brief. Thank you to all of our guests today. I will be back tomorrow at 12:15 with more Politics Live. Bye-bye.